Well, hello. I'm Robert Cook. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and I'd like to welcome you to the first GSAS alumni webinar. This is the first of a series of webinars that we'd like to share broadly with the Tufts alumni community. It will be a chance to learn more about Tufts and give everyone, regardless of their physical location, a chance to digitally engage with our outstanding students and faculty. Tonight's topic is going to be called Terra Incognita, the digital futures of the arts and humanities. Now, digital humanities is an academic field or approach concerned with the application of computational tools and methods to traditional areas of humanities, such as literature, history, philosophy, and the arts. Now, digital humanities and art activities have certainly increased in the last few decades. Scholars from around the world are working digitally, working in networked environments, creating new norms and conventions for publishing, and regularly using computational tools and analytical methods like data and text mining, visualization, network analysis, topic modeling, and digital archiving to enrich their scholarship. Tonight, we've gathered 4 of Tufts' top scholars who are part of the now and the future of the digital arts and humanities. Our goal this evening is to learn more about each of their perspectives about the future of digital scholarship and their own disciplines. So our panel, our 4 panelists, the first going from my right is Dr. Malcolm Turvey. He is the Sal Gittleman Professor in Film and Media Studies and is a professor in the Department of Arts and Art History and director of our Film and Media Studies program. Malcolm has a variety of interests, but is currently working on finishing a book called Playtime, Jacques Tati, and comedic modernism, which explores the reasons why many avant-garde artists in the 20th century were drawn to the films of Chaplin, Keaton, and other prominent film comedians. Next in line is Dr. Heather Nason, a professor in drama and dance and the chair of that department. A Jumbo alum, she joins us from just having recently directed the Eugene O'Neill play Desire Under the Elms. This play has a creative, interesting combination of live action and music that truly features the talents of the outstanding students and singers who were part of it. Good job. I saw it the other night. Third is Dr. Joe Auner. He's a professor in the Department of Music and the Dean of Academic Affairs in the School of Arts and Sciences. His scholarly work focuses on Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School, turn of the century Vienna, Weimar, Berlin, and music and technology. I've enjoyed his office. He has 2 turntables and a microphone and has a scholarly interest in hip hop and rap. Finally, at the far end, Dr. Marie-Claire Beaulieu, an associate professor in the classics department and director of our Perseids project. This is a digital humanities project that's at the cutting edge. She's working on creating and disseminating knowledge about the ancient world and making it more accessible through a collaborative online environment in which users can edit, translate, and produce commentaries on a variety of ancient source documents. She's also a key player in our new Digital Humanities Master's Program in the Classic Department, Digital Tools in Pre-Modern Studies. So we thought we'd start with a presentation from each of the individuals to set the table and learn more about the digital humanities. Then we'd have an open discussion of digital scholarship and the implications of it for our knowledge, for our students, and for the university. So Malcolm, I think you're up first. So
thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. We only have a few minutes each to talk, so I thought I'd say just a little bit, excuse me, about how digital technologies are impacting my discipline, the discipline of film studies, and then just a little bit about how they're also impacting the object that we study, which is film. So I thought I would just show a little bit about the work of one of my colleagues in my discipline, a person called Yuri Tsivian, who's a professor at Chicago, and the kind of work that he's doing, I think, is a very good example of how digital tools are transforming the discipline of film history. So what Yuri and his colleagues at Chicago have done, is set up a website, which you can see now, in which they have a piece of software which people can download, and that piece of software allows whoever downloads it to measure the shot lengths of films on DVD. So for example, this is just some films that people have done recently. So if I just actually go to the database. Here's a list of films that have recently been done by people. So, for example, let's see. Oh, they're even doing Radiohead Live. Look at that. But if you take a film like Easy Rider, what somebody has done is downloaded a piece of software. Actually, they haven't done it yet. That's a very bad example. Let me find a different example. Sicario. Here we go. Here's a recent film. What they've done is downloaded a piece of software, and that allows them to measure the shot length. And you can see in this column here, this is the average shot length is 7.5 seconds in this particular film. Now, so what, you might say? Well, shot length is something that film historians are very interested in because we want to know how fast or how slowly films are edited. And it's always something that we've only had a very vague idea about. But now, this is essentially the film history version of big data. If you have enough people doing this, you can collect a huge amount of data that shows you how fast films are edited, how slowly they're edited over time. So, for example, if we look at Rear Window, the Alfred Hitchcock film, if we go down here, and hopefully this will load up, this is a graph which shows, unfortunately it's not very clear on my screen, but hopefully you can see it on your screen. It shows where Rear Window is within films across the 20th century. So there's thousands of films here, and every place that you click a dot, for example, this is the Fallen Angel, the Preminger film from 1945, that has an extraordinarily high shot length of 31.9. Rear Window is probably more typical, if I can just get to it. I'm not going to be able to put this is not sensitive enough. But the point is, hopefully you can see the graph. There's a great deal of data here about the shot lengths of films. Now, this is really just the beginning, I think. As software becomes more sophisticated, you'll be able to measure, for example, the distance of the camera from the object that it's filming over many, many films, over many years. You'll be able to measure things like camera movement. So when is the camera moved a lot in film history? When is it not moved a lot, and so on. And so these digital tools, I think, are really helping to create a sort of big data set about films unlike we've ever had before, and allow us to understand stylistic parameters, editing, shot composition, shot length, and so on, that we've really only had a very sort of vague idea about in the past. So this, to me, is a very good example of how digital technologies are positively impacting the humanities. Let me say a little bit now about the way that they have impacted the object that we study, which is, of course, film. And let me just bring up a couple of clips here to show you. Hopefully these will be interesting to you. This one here, right? Okay, so of course the most obvious way in which digital technologies have impacted filmmaking, I think they really have transformed filmmaking, is through what is commonly called CGI, so computer-generated imagery, and that's very, very important. But there are other ways in which they've changed things too, and I think one of the most interesting, which is becoming more and more common in the filmmaking world, is the use of computers to control cameras themselves. So rather than have cameras being operated by human beings, more and more cameras are being operated by computers. And this short clip from the making of Spider-Man 2 will give you a sense of why computers are being used more and more in filmmaking.
Ever filmed with?
In this case, we're actually trying to get the footage on location as opposed to doing it 100% CG like we did in the last movie. So it's a cheaper way to do the shot this way than it would be to do the whole city in computer-generated buildings and such.
We take a model of the city, meaning a computer-generated model, generally something that's shot from satellites, gives us a sense of where these buildings are, accurate to 3 or 4 feet. Then we take in that computer model, we place a camera, and we make a computer-based move through that virtual city.
This is the pre-visualization that we loaded into motion control. The move here is done in Maya. And it would be really hard to follow a Spider-Man out there that doesn't exist. So we do it here first to get all the pans and tilts correct, and then load it into motion control, and off it goes.
The idea is to show ultimately what's going to appear in the final movie. And when we bring the program out here and put it into the SpiderCam, it duplicates exactly the moves that we made in that model. And because the model was accurate, we have an accurate sense of what we're going to capture here. Very nice, very nice.
So in case that isn't clear, what's going on here is that the filmmakers have pre-visualized this scene, which is one in which Spider-Man is you know, spinning his spider webs, whatever they're called, and moving between buildings. What they've done is they've pre-visualized the camera movements on computer first, and then use that pre-visualization to control the actual camera that films those movements, therefore creating something much more precise than any human being could do. And this is one of the reasons that computers are being used more and more in the actual the filming of things. And I'll just show one more example. If you want to click it just one more time so that title goes away. So I think another way in which digital technologies are really affecting filmmaking is that they're transforming acting, which is, I know, something my colleague Heather will be interested in, through this process that you see being described here. If you could click it one more time.
We left off in the first film, which is daunting because I think we were really successful with the things that happened in the first film, both visually and storytelling-wise. We had a new villain, a very good villain, I think a very challenging villain, and we also had to show our character in the flesh.
Doing the data or the photo acquisitions that we did on Tobey Maguire and Alfred Molina both had to happen very early on. Building those two characters for the movie they're two hero characters for the film, and to be able to do the shots for the movie, we need to start by building the characters and having them ready to put into shots. So it was probably one of the first development efforts that we had to embark on.
John worked with Tobey Maguire, I worked with Alfred Molina, and we essentially directed them in facial performances of different ranges of emotion with motion capture.
We measured every inch of their body, we cyber scanned every inch of them from head to toe. We did a lot of motion capture on their movements, facial expressions, how they open and close their eyes, how they smile, how they frown, you know, pretty much all of the range of emotions that we could get. We had them read lines from the script so we could capture performance of how they might say different lines of dialogue. Pretty much anything that we could capture in terms of photographic elements or data elements through motion capture we did.
And then we took that data and applied that to the CG model, so that every time you see them in a fight sequence, if you stop and you go through slowly, you'll see all these different facial expressions on the characters. The shot that probably has to be, you know, the proof in the pudding is the one at the end when they're in the pier and Doc Ock pulls down the fusion machine and the crescent's down into the water and essentially drowns himself. The camera has him, he's full screen, and he's all CG, everything in the shot is CG, and he drifts away down into blackness ultimately.
We had discussed the potential of having Alfred do this underwater fall away, okay? It became cumbersome at best, so we decided to make the character into a computer-generated character. And that was one of our big challenges in the making of this movie. This is a close-up. We have to actually make believable Alfred Molina, Doc Ock, in the flesh, in this close, at the beginning of the shot, and take him away from camera. And add to that, he's got to be underwater, which is kind of a unique deal.
So what I really like about this technology, this technique, which is called motion capture, is that it doesn't involve the replacement of the human being by the digital technology, but a synthesis of the two, although it does transform acting. So what's happening here is that people like Alfred Molina are essentially performing a range of expressions. They're sort of creating a catalog of expressions which are recorded digitally and then are used in the computer program to build the final CGI shot. So the CGI shot, the computer-generated shot, is being built out of this catalog of facial expressions and movements that are pre-recorded by the actors. So it's a good example of how human being and digital technology are sort of collaborating in filmmaking. There's a lot more I can say about this, but I will pass the baton now to my colleague, Heather Nathans.
Thank you very much. So I think actually we're talking about two sides of the same coin, because you're talking about what can be captured and preserved and then recreated as performance. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is liveness, because I'm a theater creator, and I'm also somebody who spends a lot of time in an archive looking for traces of life. So I love to think of titles for things. I am incapable of creating a presentation without thinking of a title. So for me, this was Acolyte in the Archive, and that's what I was thinking about, because I want to share a personal tale of two research approaches, one that predated the digital archive and one that would not have been possible without it. And thinking about both invited me to think about the rituals associated with archival research and how those have been reframed by the digital. So my first book was about the post-revolutionary Boston theater in the 1790s, at a time when the city was still very adamantly anti-theater. There were still laws against the theater, etc. And yet, by 1794, Boston actually has a huge theater that has red velvet curtains and chandeliers and a company imported from England. And again, it is still illegal. And that is not the kind of thing that you can actually build and open without people noticing. So part of my work was to figure out, how did that actually happen? And so I always look for the names behind any kind of historical moment or movement. And so what I was doing for that project was going through literally hundreds and hundreds of newspapers, trying to figure out how this came to be, what the networks were that actually made the creation, the opening of this theater possible. And this was an age when there weren't digitized newspapers. So I was going through microfilm, and I was going through actual bound copies of newspapers. And so if you've ever looked at a 19th century, or an 18th century, I should say, in this case, newspaper, it's like reading ingredient labels. I mean, the print is that small. And you're either sitting there reading it on a microfilm thing, trying not to get nauseous from the way that it's moving, or you are standing in an archive hunched over something that is about table size, trying not to have it come apart in your hands as you gently turn page after page, reading through newspapers in an age before headlines, scanning for the tiny word theater. So that was actually how I built that project, trying to figure out where these names were. But what emerged in that project was every time almost that there was something about the theater, somewhere on the same page would be something about the Boston Tontine Association. And I actually had to look up what a tontine was, so that was my first step. But it was always the same people involved in it, and a tontine, or this tontine, was essentially a private life insurance company that functioned as a kind of informal bank. So the men that were involved in trying to get a theater for the city were also involved in this, and they collected about $2 million. And these were the men who transformed post-revolutionary Boston. So if you go down to Boston's financial district, Federal Street, Milk Street, that's where the theater was. And what they did was they said, we have a vision for what this city should look like. And they built beautiful houses that were modeled after houses in Bath, England, that became known as the Tontine Crescent. And at the end of their crescent, they built their beautiful theater to say, we have arrived. And that is a connection that I would not have made had I not had to read every blessed newspaper, scanning page after page and finding the proximity of these two sets of information, these two sets of communities. So it was there, the fact that there wasn't a digital archive available to me, that actually made those things come together for me. Tale number 2. So I was working on my second book about the representations of slavery on the American stage from the colonial period up until the Civil War, and I hit a dead end with a play called Aunt Dinah's Pledge, which is the first 19th century play that we have with a temperance heroine who is a person of color. I knew the play existed, I had the script, it was a novel as well. I couldn't find the record of a single production. So I had been sitting in the Boston Athenaeum, basically doing the researcher's equivalent of banging my head against a wall, and I finally thought, you know, what the heck, I'm going to Google it. So now I always say, when in doubt, Google it. So I Googled it, and there, in a digital archive for a tiny little church in Madison, Wisconsin, the title popped up as part of the search. And I thought, how did this play get to Madison, Wisconsin? And so that actually, that serendipitous Google search led me into a whole new section of the book that I hadn't envisioned writing, because I'd never heard of this church before. I obviously wouldn't have gone to look for Aunt Dinah's Pledge there. But what it allowed me to do was to write a whole new section of the book about how instrumental Wisconsin had been in funneling slaves up through the Underground Railroad and into Canada. So for me, these two examples point to the way that digital humanities and archiving and resources have fundamentally changed the way that we do research. By the time my first book came out, I could claim to have read almost every newspaper that was published between 1785 and 1800 in Massachusetts, Boston, Philadelphia. But my second book, which covered a much longer sweep of time and it covered basically the United States, that wasn't possible. I had a very different kind of breadth and depth of knowledge. And it's been an incredible boon to historians, this kind of digital mapping of our world, because it means that you can do your research in a different way. You can do your research in your pajamas, right? You don't have to travel to an archive. I have colleagues who've been unable to accept research fellowships because they can't travel hundreds of miles to an archive. It's made it a much more level playing field for colleagues, for students, and thinking about access and opportunity to engage with information. I also think it's a huge boon in terms of thinking about something as ephemeral as performance, because it means I'm not reliant on only one captured visual of one production. So if you think about how many times Cats or Les Mis has been produced, we don't have a recording of every single one of those, or we didn't. Now you could. If you look online, for example, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of illegally uploaded recordings of Hamilton. So you can actually click through and compare performances. You can compare when audiences laugh. You can compare when things are quiet. So that's another kind of boon as well. I read an interesting piece about the body in the library, exploring how our physical relationships with archival materials has changed in this age of digital preservation. And so in the library, you may have to use gloves, magnifying glasses, especially climate-controlled rooms. You have to touch everything very, very carefully, and there's a kind of ritualized aspect to it. And I am trying to think about how our rituals now are going to change now that I can sit in my study, in my PJs at 2 in the morning if I want, and click through. So I'm trying to think about what new rituals will emerge around this digitized realm and how that's going to change the way we teach and the way we do our scholarship. Thank you.
All right, Joe, I think you're up next.
Good to be here. I think what I want to talk about actually relates in interesting ways to what you both were saying. And I'm a music historian, and my relationship to the digital really focuses on what the impact of the digital has meant for musical developments, compositional developments in the 20th and 21st century, obviously increasing a lot after World War II, once it actually existed. And it's part of a broader interest in technology. I teach a course called Music Technology and Digital Culture. And what that course does is it really looks at technological developments, starting in the early part of the 20th century with the impact of recording and the phonograph, and going to the radio. But then we spent a lot of time looking at the impact of the digital, starting in the 50s, where the first real computer music emerges in the 50s. You have very affordable digital instruments in the 1980s, the rise of digital sampling and hip-hop in the 80s, and really the still emerging transformations of the internet, which we're still in the middle of seeing what that is meaning for all aspects of the creation of music, the dissemination of music, and reception of music. So I'm interested in what the digital means for music, for the object of music, as we say, but also, as you both did, about the kind of work we do, what we think the object of our work is, how we work, who gets to work on it. I also have a personal connection to this. I guess I could say I'm sort of traumatized by the digital, that I grew up with a strong interest in electronic music and was very involved with analog synthesizers, and that's before the digital. I worked as a recording engineer, where the job was to work with magnetic tape and splice it, put it together with splicing tape. And so then my last year of college, I chose my college because we had a giant synthesizer that was about as big as an industrial kitchen. And then my last year of college, we suddenly got this digital synthesizer that was a little tabletop thing about this big, and instead of hundreds of knobs, it had one knob. And then instead of working with magnetic tape and tape machines, suddenly you have digital recording devices and DAT tape, and all those devices and technologies had such a different framework for working, thinking. So what I'm interested in, how the digital is changing what it means to be a musician, how we think, how we hear, but also how we relate to each other, how we imagine ourselves, how we imagine our bodies, how we exist in the world. And in a way, what I'm doing is very low-tech compared to what Malcolm was talking about. And in a way, it's things that are happening that are so much a part of our daily experience that we don't even notice it anymore. And a lot of that has to do, I've been particularly interested in the voice and how we interact with the voice, and the fact that very often when the phone rings now, there is not a human on the other end of the phone. There's an automated voice or at some point, or sometimes we don't even know if it's an automated voice or a human voice. So I want to play some music for you that I think articulates this in a nice way. Good. So this is, well, I'll say a little bit more. The musician's name is Prefuse73. I don't think that's probably his given name, but it's significant that that's his name. And this is a kind of music that grew out of hip-hop that's all based on samples, digital samples of other sounds. And people who do this kind of music use every kind of sound you can imagine. Other music, noises of nature. One of my favorite records is all based upon samples of medical procedures, the sounds of medical procedures. So that's strange. This song called No No is based upon some very manipulated samples of some classic hip-hop. The song One Love by the rapper Nas off this 1995 release Illmatic, and then the singer Erykah Badu. But then there are also a lot of other voices, little chocolate voices that we don't know who they are, and maybe Prefuse73 doesn't even know who they are. But as you listen to this, I want you to listen to the fact that almost every sound you hear is a voice. But the voices are being used to create the whole structure. So where do I click? Leave. Next one. So if you were just listening to that casually, not paying attention, you might just think you're listening to some hip-hop. But if you listen at all carefully, you'll realize, wait, that sounds strange, and it's all completely chopped up. And I think the producer is going out of his way to make you hear that there isn't a singer there, that you're working with the sound of a voice and the sounds of the other voices to create this this very different kind of texture. And that the brokenness and the fractures, I think, are part of the whole meaning of it. Now, producers who do this kind of music use the voice a lot, and I think there's good reason for it, because the voice is this sound that we really respond to. It's a sound that's very interesting to the brain, and it activates the brain in interesting ways. But here you have a voice that isn't coming from a person. It's coming from a sample that has been chopped up and put into a device like this machine, where you would be playing the parts of it and triggering the samples that way, or using software like that. And the waveform you see is actually the sample of the main voice that has been chopped up to create the lead vocal here. But it's interesting that you've got a piece here that's using a voice, but it's using the voice just as the most raw kind of material to create a new kind of piece, probably without the knowledge and maybe even without the permission of the person who originally did the voice. But this kind of there are a lot of ramifications of this with the producers who do this. That, as I mentioned, his name's Prefuse73. that that's not his name, but he also produces music under many, many different names and styles, and it's very common for people in this field that you're using all these samples of borrowed styles and borrowed sounds, and that your own identity becomes sort of a structure that you can use and change. And I'll show you one other thing. This is on the different side of things. So that's really looking at the impact of the artwork. This is more of an impact on how we work and what we look at. And this is one of the most famous pieces in the 20th century is this piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds by John Cage. And in the original performance of the piece, Cage, a pianist went out and closed the lid of the piano in a concert hall and sat there for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And then the piece is all the sounds that happened during that stretch of time. Now you'd think, why is that a famous piece? But it's a revolutionary piece in thinking, well, what is music? What are the borders of sound and music? What's the audience's role? How do we listen? It was a rather esoteric piece in history books and so forth. There's occasional concerts, but the John Cage estate put out this app that you can see where you can listen to 4 minutes and 33 seconds as it sounds in John Cage's apartment. So you can hear the 4 minutes and 33 seconds of the traffic noise from his New York apartment. But then the other thing is then people all over the world can upload their own versions of the piece. So every dot you can see there is a recording someone has uploaded of 4 minutes and 33 seconds in their own environment and the way the piece means to them. And I think it's $1.99, so it's not completely free, this app, but it's really worth it. And what I think is interesting is, well, what do we make of this now that we have thousands of these recordings of people from all over the world capturing what this piece means to them in their own environment and their own place. So that poses the problem to me of the digital humanities are needed to understand what's going on here.
Okay, our last presentation, then we'll turn back into a group discussion.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you to my colleagues. I think these perspectives are really interesting and show the breadth of what the digital opens up to us. So I'd like to shift maybe the discussion a little to the classroom, because we are all teachers here, and I think one of the big challenges here is, how do we teach our students to be part of this digital world? How do we bring them into the conversation? And that's particularly, I think, a challenge in the humanities, where our students frequently do not have a background with digital tools and so forth. So I came to Tufts in 2010, and that was my challenge, as stated in my job advertisement here. I have a classics job, so very straightforward description, but this note is what really drew me to this job. We especially welcome candidates who can support contributions to an original research by undergraduates as well as MA students. So I think that's really interesting, and that shows what it is we're doing here at Tufts that I think is very much a sign of our leadership, is how do we integrate students here? And in my discipline, as well in many disciplines of the humanities, that's rare. Students don't participate in lab work the way they intend to do in STEM fields and so forth. So how exactly do we do that? I'm going to show a few ways that we have approached this question, and there's of course a lot of ways we could have done that. So we decided, and when I say we, it's the whole team, and in particular the co-director of the Perseids project, who is a software engineer, has worked with me on this project since 2011. So we put the Perseids tools together, which are open source tools which enable micro-publications, in particular by students, but any member of the public is welcome to do this. And what is a micro-publication? That's basically an assertion. It can be as simple as stating Zeus is the husband of Terra. That's a micro-publication. But if you aggregate lots and lots of these, you're going to get a body of work that you can actually read from and that you can learn from, right? Sometimes they're a little more complex. So, for instance, my students in Latin transcribe manuscripts and so forth. So I'm going to show examples of that. Micro-publications can take many forms and many breadths and depths. So what do? They do data-driven analysis, basically. So we make sure that these micro-publications are serialized, and that they constitute machine actionable data, and that they also constitute a body of work that we can reproduce the results from, right? So anybody is free to download that data and perform the experiment with it or do something else with it as well. So that's interesting because then our students are participating directly in the creation of new knowledge, and they also help us develop the tools, right? So we do agile development, so we release software as it's being produced. So the students help us in finding issues with it or finding new directions we can take it in. And of course, that helps us develop the curriculum itself, right? How do we teach? And every time I teach this, I find new ways to integrate the digital world. So this is Perseids, and everyone is absolutely welcome to create an account or follow us on Twitter. So here's an example of a micro-publication. So this is a Greek inscription. It is a tombstone. And so the student goes in the Perseids environment, and I've done this in intermediary Greek. So this is an undergraduate class, not a very high level, not a graduate class. Anyone can do this. So basically, you define with your mouse a region of interest on the inscription. In this particular case, we've chosen to do words, but you could do it by character, you could do it by line, you could do the decoration. So you have to drive your choices. Your research question will drive that choice. So in this particular case, we're interested in the words that are present in the inscription. So you define each word with your mouse, and then you do a transcription right there in the little rectangles that are created. And so this then gets encoded into an XML document, which is below in the environment. And then with that XML document, we can do further markup and a presentation of that material online. And of course, the data then can get aggregated into repositories of Greek inscriptions and so forth. Here's another form of micro-publication. So this is a tree bank. People may be familiar with diagramming sentences from grade school. I think many of us here may have done that, right? Where you define what's the subject, what's the object, and so forth, right? So this is exactly the same thing. This is through the Arethusa app, which is part of the Perseids suite of tools. So what we're doing here is setting up this sentence and color coding it so verbs are in red and so forth. And the students get to define the morphology and the syntax of this. And as they move words around on the screen, the relationships and the morphology of these words get encoded again in the background in an XML document, which can then be used to study the Greek language or whatever language you may be doing. So you can do things like stylometry, dependency distance, which is the distance between a word and its predicate, and so forth. So that's data that you can use to describe language. These are translation alignments, and I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to pass quickly on this. But this is the same thing. You align a word to its meaning in English or any other language, and you can use the resulting data to study the language. And finally, I would like to show this, which is a result of all these micro-publications, right? We can do outreach much better and show what it is that our disciplines are doing. So this is Flickr. As you know, this is a community where people will put their pictures from vacation and so forth. So this person is on an archaeological site and loves this Greek inscription. And my students can go in and transcribe this for them, translate it, and then do outreach to the community. So we feel that by having students participate there, first of all, they learn a lot, they create new knowledge, but they can also give back to the community and bring maybe people to the study of the ancient world who may not otherwise have even known that this is there. So that's our contribution. So I think that's my conclusion would be, what are we doing with our students? We're trying to think of humanists as digital humanists, right? And trying to give our students the tools to position themselves in a changing discipline and a changing academic environment, and position them for having innovative careers. That does it for me. Thank you.
All right. Thank each of you for those interesting presentations. We have about 15 minutes left. I was hoping we could sort of initiate a conversation around the topics that you guys raised and some of the implications of them. And so I'll start off with here's an interesting question, I think. I understand what scholarship is in a lot of traditional domains. I've looked at lots of vita, and they have things like articles, they have books. I recognize these printed units from decades and millennia of that kind of thing. Now this digital frontier seems to present all sorts of opportunities for creating digital archives or micro-publications or self-publishing your own material independent of any journal. And so I guess I would just ask you the question, how is all this going to change the traditional nature of scholarship? How are we going to measure scholars, and what are sort of the implications of that?
I would answer, I was picking up on the idea of what the students are doing and the kind of teaching we're doing, and I was thinking of two recent master's students we had in the music department who worked, I don't think they would have thought that they were doing digital humanities, but I think the work that they were doing really relates to this. One student, Mike DeRico, did a study, a master's thesis about really the role of technologies in hip-hop music and how different technologies are regarded as authentic or inauthentic. So hip-hop starts with two turntables, and that was the authentic thing. But then when the MPC that I showed you comes along, then that becomes authentic, and then the musicians have to work and show how the turntable gets taken up into this new technology. And then when they stop using the MPC and move on to like different kinds of iPad interfaces, that starts to get branded as authentic. So as a student working in that area, he had to have kind of technical expertise with all this information. But then he's gone on to a digital humanities certificate and a PhD at UCLA, where his work has been much more doing, I was thinking when you were talking about, Bob, what's the work going to be? Like one of the things he's doing are projects where you create virtual reality simulations to experience the ancient world. So it's somewhere in between game design and a sort of scholarly product that you create a three-dimensional environment where you go out and study a field. And so it's interesting in this kind of work that students are needing to develop new skill sets, like we all are, but it's also that it's possible to develop these new skill sets, that you don't have to devote your entire life maybe to learning a new skill. It may be a year or so you could learn a skill in new ways.
I agree, and I think, the point Joe is raising is that scholarship now takes so many new forms, right? So yeah, a video game is scholarship in a lot of ways, right? And in a lot of ways it isn't. And that's really interesting to explore that intersection. And I think we are facing this challenge of defining what scholarship is. And I think we're also facing the concomitant challenge, which is who are scholars as well, right? And my answer to this would be as many people as possible, please. Because that is how we know the value of research is if it is useful, if it makes sense to people, if it checks out. And how do you do that? Release your data, everybody can see it, and everybody can evaluate it, everybody can augment it. That's what I would say.
So I was the president of the American Society for Theater Research, and we joined up with the Association for Theater and Higher Education to produce a white paper on how to assess digital native scholarship for tenure and promotion cases, because we knew that this was going to be a challenge in the future, and that T&P committees that are used to, I can touch it, I've got a book in my hand, I know what that is, might not necessarily know what to do if I submit a video game as my contribution towards tenure, and how do you evaluate it? And we also have a tension that we negotiate, a concept that we're always discussing, which is the archive versus the repertoire. And the archive can privilege a certain kind of knowledge. It can privilege the tangible. It can privilege the written, versus the repertoire, which can actually reveal a tremendous amount about a culture, the development of a people, particularly of traditionally marginalized groups that have not been able to express or preserve their materials in an archive that's been dedicated and created in a certain way. So that's something that I think we are always aware of as well, and I'll be interested to see how the archive and the repertoire debate also begins to circle into the kinds of micro-scholarship and things, micro-publications that you're talking about, or Joe, the kind of musical compositions that you're talking about.
All right, so the four of you obviously are very enthusiastic. I know a lot of faculty. I'm not sure everyone is equally enthusiastic about the digital humanities as a thing. Some might say there's no common essence to it, that it's a collection of approaches and it's not a unified field of study. And as such, we shouldn't talk about it as a discipline. Thoughts about that particular criticism, or the nature of that resistance, or what you think will happen in the future to that?
Well, I think the humanities is just the humanities, right? It's becoming digital by virtue of the times we live in, and that's fine. I think we're adapting to our environment. But what I think is interesting with these methods is that it really highlights how profoundly interdisciplinary all the humanities are, and so it allows us to think across departments, across disciplines, and to really rethink maybe our over specialization and collaborate more freely with our colleagues, and as Joe mentioned, also learn new skills, right? So we're no longer confined to the tool set that we've been trained with.
I guess I would say that I would hate to think that the digital humanities entails the supplanting of more traditional humanistic methods by digital methods. I think ideally what one is talking about is an extension or an addition to traditional methods. But something Heather said, which I think is very important, is that she made a very important discovery that she could have only discovered through the pretty traditional method of sitting in an archive, which people have been doing for a long time,
right,
and very painstakingly going through documents. And I know in my own field that empirical historians, they spend a lot of time sitting in archives looking at film prints. And I don't see any way of getting rid of that, and nor do I think it should be gotten rid of. And the reason for that is that when you're looking at a film print in an archive, you're typically watching it on a Steenbeck or some other system where you can advance it when you want and rewind it and slow it down. And you're not looking at it on a screen, you're looking at it at a smaller screen that's much closer to you. And you notice things about the film that you just don't see if you are just watching, a DVD copy of it on a television screen or something like that. So I think, I don't think, certainly I would not endorse the idea that traditional humanistic methods are simply being replaced by digital ones. I mean, ideally, I think what we're talking about is an extension, not a wholesale, transformation.
I was going to say, I just have a question about how the way in which the experience is mediated once it becomes digital. So I'm thinking about, for example, the moments in the archives when you're not just looking at print, you're looking at a 100-year-old piece of wedding cake that's been preserved, or you're turning the page of a scrapbook, which I've done, to encounter a giant picture made of human hair. There is something very tangible about that moment, or when you could pick up a stage prop and handle it, that changes when it's on a screen and there's a keyboard and it's not actually a 3D experience. So I will be interested to see how this field moves forward in terms of can it help people who will not be able to have those encounters get some sense of them. So I think that's very interesting.
I was thinking that it used to be, I think when the movie The Matrix came out, there were these kind of fantasies of what the future would be like. We were all in this kind of artificial reality where we were, completely lost our bodies and we were just living in a computer fabrication. And it really hasn't turned out that way as far as we know, but it has turned out that we are living in an environment where it's like a mixed reality or embedded reality where we're permeated by digital. You might even say the fact that we're doing a webinar now is a good example of that. And the number of computers in this room is huge, and we're using multiple ways where we don't even notice it. So I was imagining that if you imagine scholarship in the humanities, it might be more of, instead of a virtual reality, more of this mixed or embedded reality where we all are in various ways interacting with the new technologies, but always ideally from the strengths that we developed in the disciplines. But I was thinking when you both were talking that the amazing thing now is I work on this composer, Arnold Schoenberg, and he is, there's this huge archive where you can get everything scanned. I think still you would want to go ultimately to look at the real things, but I think now more than ever, the access to these materials and letting people who never would have had an opportunity to see these things or see these archives, to see what's there, and then hopefully open it up to many more people who would never have had access. So that's the mixed reality version of digital humanities.
And that's, as I was saying, that's what I love about it, is that people who can't afford to or wouldn't otherwise be able to take the time to do it can actually see. And what I'm trying to figure out is how we can also give them that experience of touching. Because for me as a historian, what I want to be able to do is to plunge into the past rather than dragging the past to me. And so how do I help somebody recreate that experience of, this letter, this handwriting, this hair, this wedding cake, the gloves, you name it, the wreath of flowers. So how do I go towards the past rather than always hauling it up to me?
And I think another aspect of traditional archival research is the aleatory dimension of stumbling across things by chance. I mean, I can't tell you how many scholars I know who built whole books, indeed careers, out of things that they found purely by chance in the archive. They've asked for a particular box of papers, they've been given the wrong one, or they say, something's been misfiled in a particular box of papers, or they just happen to, they're bored one day and they see something and they look at it, and it turns out to be very important. So that, I think our disciplines, whatever the digital humanities is or are, would be incredibly impoverished if any of that goes away. I just don't see how that that goes away.
I'd like to reassure you, in my field, the digital methods are really enhancing what we already do well. And I will say that in traditional classics, it's very easy to hide something you don't know in a footnote. If you're producing a data set, you can't. It's going to be clear and say that you don't know this or that it's badly formed or whatever, right? So I think the transparency that it gives us is crucial in actually establishing the quality of the scholarship and in showing actually what you've done on the source documents, which is the stuff of our discipline. So,
well, and the flip side, what I think maybe to connect with what Malcolm was saying, I just learned today that the library here bought a book that I believe was from something like 1435. It's a very beautiful illuminated Bible that's going to be part of the collection where the students are going to be able to interact with this Bible and work with it. That you can still read it. You can still turn the pages. The problem with all this digital information is it's so fragile and ephemeral that it's very hard to open a digital file from 10 years ago. And one from 20 years ago might as well be doesn't exist. And so the idea of something for 600 years ago, 600 years in the future, a digital document that will still be legible and usable is unimaginable.
Yes, well, one of the challenges for a webinar in the future is to talk about the whole issue of preservation and archiving. It's a really interesting and deep topic. We only have time for, I think, one more question. And I guess this one I think is appropriate as we're thinking about our students. what do we need to do as scholars? What do we need to do as a university to make sure our students are well prepared for a future that is ever changing, rapidly changing?
What I would say is that what I would like my students to get out of this experience is that they can be nimble, and that one field is not the be-all and end-all, that they can branch out. And I think Joe gave a great example of that as well, right? So the career of the future is a career that shifts and moves, and I'd like to give my students the confidence to be able to do that.
And I guess I would say, in my own experience in working with students, the way disciplines are evolving is, I think people can bring their full skill set, all their interests, all their background, things that they might not think were important or would be important could suddenly turn out to be important, right? I feel like when I started graduate school, my discipline was very well defined, and the authorities could say without a doubt what you should know and how you should study it. I think that's completely changing now. I think that's really exciting. I think it's not just because of the digital and these new technologies, but I think that is making the huge variety of people's interests and skill sets more relevant and useful in the world.
I will sometimes ask my students to draw how they think, because not everybody thinks or researches in the same way. And so I had a student one time who said, I feel like I'm like a dog who goes into the backyard and digs a whole bunch of little holes. And I said, well, great. Figure out how to connect those holes, right? So you dig a hole here, you dig a hole here, you dig a hole here. Then your next task is to map them together, and you can constantly remap them into different patterns. Some people are linear thinkers, et cetera, but it's that drawing how you think that starts to let them imagine how they might use a digital archive in a more creative and nimble way once they realize that the way I use it isn't necessarily going to be the way they use it. And it does start to allow for some serendipity. You know, I'll try to model, let's try these and see what we can find. Now you try it, see what you can find. So it's very, very basic, but draw how you think sometimes is enough to get somebody started if they're feeling a little stymied about how to approach something.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I guess, what I always say to my students is not to get hung up on particular technologies and skills, because they become obsolete so quickly. And I remember this argument that was being made about 10 years ago that, you know, every student coming out of college should know how to design a website. And, you know, that seems a completely absurd idea now. At the time, I remember there were, you know, very, very prominent people saying, well, this is the future, you know, how are you going to be able to live in the future without knowing how to design a website? Well, of course, we don't need to know how to design a website. It's a preposterous idea. And I think we sometimes, you know, we're so wowed by the new and the contemporary technology that we tend to think, oh, that this is what everyone needs to know. Whereas it seems to me it's really the sort of broader significance. You know, when we're talking about, when we're teaching our students about digital technologies, what we really should be doing is talking about the sort of broader sort of impact and significance and the history leading up to them, rather than kind of fetishizing the latest technological development, which will be obsolete very quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. So our time is up. As I was assured when I began to think about having a webinar for the first time, that whenever I can bring my colleagues together to talk, it is always an interesting occasion, and we could easily go on for a long time, and perhaps we will after we sign off as well. But thank you very much for those of you who participated in this first GSAS alumni webinar. As I said, this is the first in a series of these that we hope to hold over the next few years as a chance for us to overcome the time and space that separates Tufts from wherever you might be at the moment, but that, you know, it's a way for us to recognize with new digital tools that we can have a lifelong relationship between the alumni and the faculty that are currently here and the students that are here. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and the weekend, and thank you for viewing.
Didn't they say that about sound, though? it'll never last. Remember the scene in Singing in the Rain? It's vulgar.
That's true.